Hi, everyone. My name is Sam, and on behalf of Book Soup, I'd like to thank you all for joining us for today's event with Shayda Kafai in conversation with Alice Wong discussing Crip Kinship, the disability, justice, and art activism of Sins Invalid. If you need closed captionings for tonight, we do have that at the green button below the viewer screen. And for we're doing image descriptions of ourselves. So I am, white female, and my background is not very exciting, but it is window blinds with little festive Christmas lights. And I'm wearing a red and black plaid shirt. And I have brown hair for the most part, growing out my highlights. So more exciting description there. So thank you all for joining us. Tonight's event will end with a Q&A, and to submit a question, please use the Ask a Question button at the bottom of the screen. It is to the left of the chat area. And if you see a question on the list that you'd like for our speakers to answer, please click the like button and it'll bump it up in the queue, and we will try to answer as many questions as time will allow. Please also feel free to engage with each other and the conversation and reading in the chat area. We'll be hosting more virtual events in the near future, and you can learn more about them on our website. You can sign up for our email newsletter, follow us on social media at Book Soup, and you can also follow our Crowdcast page right here to get direct notifications, and past events are also available on our YouTube channel. Please support Book Soup and our authors tonight by purchasing a copy of tonight's featured book. Normally, you can do that at the green button, but since we have the captions, you can actually scroll up to the top of the chat and purchase Crip Kinship there. But I'm actually going to send it in the chat area again right now, just so that you don't have to scroll all the way up. So there it is. And we have signed book plates, but I think that Shayda is actually going to come in store and sign them herself. So that's always more fun, feels a little more personal. So you definitely want to get your copy at Book Soup. I'm not sure if you can get a signed copy anywhere else. So please support your local bookstore either way. And we're also selling digital audiobooks and ebooks through Libro FM and Kobo for those interested. And for those local to Los Angeles, nearby, or visiting, we are open for in-store browsing. So please stop by from 10 a.m. to 7 p.m. and come say hi. We would love to have you. And with that said, let me introduce our guests for this evening. Shayda Kafai, she, her, is an assistant professor of gender and sexuality studies at California State Polytechnic University, Pomona. As a queer, mad femme of color, she commits to enacting the many ways we can reclaim our body minds from intersecting systems of oppression. Shayda is an educator scholar who centers disability justice and collective care practices in the spaces she cultivates. Our In Conversation guest tonight, Alice Wong, she, her, is the founder and director of the Disability Visibility Project, an online community dedicated to creating, sharing, and amplifying disability, media, and culture. Alice is the editor of Disability Visibility, First-Person Stories from the 21st Century, an anthology of essays by disabled people, and Disability Visibility, 17 First-Person Stories for Today, an adapted version of the anthology for young readers. I'm also going to share links to those books in the chat area, so stay tuned for that shortly. Alice is currently working on her memoir, Year of the Tiger, which comes out with Vintage Books in 2022, and you can find her on Twitter at sfdirewolf. And without further ado, I'm going to turn the camera over to Shayda and Alice. We are so honored to have you tonight at Book Soup. Thank you all for joining us from home and here, and thank you also to our interpreters, Kyla and Ray, and for Nick, who's doing our closed captions. Thank you for all of your support being with us. And for everyone at home, please relax, sit back, and enjoy the presentation.
Hey, everyone. I just want to thank Sam so much and everyone at Book Soup for putting together this event. I do want to say that if and when this pandemic ends, I hope, bookstores continue to have these online events, because I think we can't go back to normal, or what we thought of as normal. And as somebody who came out with a book last year who does not travel, this has been the only way I've been able to really, be out there. And I think this pandemic has showed a lot of us what is possible. And it's so timely now that I'm in conversation with Shayda, my buddy, to talk about crip culture and the future. And I'm honored to be in this space. I am an Asian American disabled woman. I'm wearing a dark gray leopard print fleece jacket. My background is totally dark because I am a creature of the night. There is a mask over my nose that is attached to a ventilator. And I am just so happy to be here. Shayda, do you want to introduce yourself or describe yourself first? And then we'll get into it.
Sure. Hi, everyone. I am an olive-skinned femme with pixie cut hair, and it's black, and my bangs go to the left. Today I have purple lipstick on with like geometric triangle-shaped wooden earrings. I'm wearing a black long sleeve shirt. I have tattoos on my arms that will show. And I'm sitting in my aunt and uncle's house. There's a beige couch in the back with glittery silver pillows, and the wall is dark gray.
So Shayda, hello. So I think one of the things I like to do, I think that's part of my crip culture is, whenever I'm in conversation with a friend, I do a check-in. So, this year and really last year has been so hard for everyone, but especially, let's face it, multiply marginalized people. How are you doing? And just how are you faring? Just, if you could just share if you want.
I love that question, and I love how in crip space, I feel like it's always been this powerful practice, but how it's now filtering into other spaces. And yeah, like you said, I hope we don't lose these pieces of wisdom and practice. I'm doing well. I got to move my body a little bit today and stretch, and I ate food, and I have my water here. So I'm feeling good. How are you feeling?
Well, I'm just excited to be here talking with you because one of the things that brings me joy is to really, to share space with you. And I think, it's not just about like in-person, face-to-face spaces, but it's really about being together. And I think disabled folks, I don't mean to bring up the pandemic all the time, but this is the current context we're living in. But disabled folks have always known that there's different ways to connect. And that, it honestly wasn't, for a lot of people, this huge disruption. In many ways, this has been a disruption in terms of non-disabledness and the centering of ableist practices and ableist culture structures. But it's been, I think, so many highs and lows, really low lows, in terms of the way I think so many people have been considered disposable in our society. It has really just showed me like the bar is so low right now. And yet, I've had some personal highs as well. And I think that must be the same for you in terms of coming out with a book during this year at this particular time. I mean, I saw a recent update from you because of the supply chain. What has it been like to come out with a book at this very surreal time? I mean, not just as a writer, but clearly this has been different.
Yeah, so I mean, this is definitely my first experience with this. And I have to say, so even given like supply chain, paper shortage, like all of that, the first word that came to my mind was like, for how do I feel about this? I feel liberated. because I could not, there's no way I could have done as many stops and speak to as many amazing people and support as many small independent bookstores if we didn't have this ability to like check in with each other digitally and invite folks to come and, you know, record the event. And so the first thing that comes to my head about just what it's been like to like put out a book during this time has been just absolute liberation and joy. Like I was sharing before we started, like I taught a class today, like physically feeling a little exhausted, but like mentally like so nerding out, number one, that I get to talk to you today and like see you. But yeah, like the liberation and the ability not only to present and have conversations online, which is tremendous access. Like I am sitting in my comfiest pajama bottoms right now with lipstick, like that's lovely. But also like financial accessibility, you know, traveling to places is very expensive. So I feel like those things coming together has just been a really powerful opening.
Yeah, and I think that every field has been impacted, but I think, especially with publishing, so many of the ways that they've done things typically have required, you know, things that are in person or just other kinds of modes that are just, you know, in a lot of ways outdated. So this might be the little silver lining to come out of this if institutions and industries and organizations, you know, really hopefully take these lessons to heart and not just want to rush to go back to the old ways, which I think is part of this hyper-capitalist, white supremacist world, right? So, you know, there is that kind of glimmer of hope that people are just realizing there's more than one ways to be, which also I think is another aspect of crip culture, right? That's there's so many ways to be alive in the world, and I think that's just the tip of the iceberg. Speaking of the title of your book, Crip Kinship, which I think is a beautiful title, you know, I thought it was okay to share like our Crip Kinship story. So, you know, for folks in the audience, you know, Shayda and I met many years ago. I think I gave a talk or a presentation at an academic conference in San Francisco, and I don't do those very often because again, it's like, even though it's in my city, it's kind of production for me to get out of the house. You know, it's a little draining. People don't realize, like, even though it's in the same city, just there's a lot that goes into the labor if you're disabled to do some typical things, even errands. So I was there giving a talk, and afterwards, you came up to me, and I was saying that we immediately had a moment of kinship. Like you introduced yourself, and we just like organically started talking, like we just fell into this, like as if we knew each other for centuries. And that to me is powerful. It doesn't happen like all the time with other trips that I meet, but this is what's magical. And even though since then, you know, we haven't met, this is like, we haven't met in person since then, many years ago. But we've always been in touch through social media. And I feel like this is another example of how relationships exist in all kinds of forms. You know, it's not this, we can still have this intimacy in different ways. So what is your version of our initial meeting?
Oh, wow. Yeah. I was like soliciting all the strength I had to actually approach you because so before we met, I had read pretty sure this was a blog post on somebody else's website. And you had said that, like, you know, as a disabled person of color, like, you know, you're not the only one, you know, you're not a unicorn. And when I read that, I was like, oh my God, this like so aligns. And I think I might have shared that with you, that like, oh, I just read this article. And yeah, I'm so glad I took the risk and reached out. And yeah, I think like that's one of the beautiful like medicinal offerings that disabled folks offer each other, especially in navigating the pandemic and learning how to keep, you know, kinship networks going, and how to amplify each other's voices online, and just like all that lovely stuff. But yeah, I remember I was so grateful that I came up to you and said hello.
Well, I'm grateful too. I mean, these are the things that we kind of sometimes have to take those risks. And like the fact that, you know, here we are now, just so many years. I love it. I want to talk about your book. And in the introduction, you start out by saying, you know, this book is a love letter, an offering written out of need. And I think that's such a beautiful way to frame the book. Could you talk a little bit about what this need is and like all the different kind of needs you're referring to?
Yeah. So there were several things I was thinking about in that like framing of a love letter and need. One, around that time, I was reading a lot of stories of crip erasure. And so I knew that for myself as a disabled mad person, but also as a human, like I needed stories and examples of resistance, proof that we exist, that our stories are relevant. And when I first started this project, and before I learned about Sins Invalid, I Googled disabled people of color and pressed enter, and, you know, came across, of course, Disability Visibility, your website, and Valissa Thompson's Ramp Your Voice. And so I became very aware of the fact that we did exist, like disabled folks of color exist, and then disabled, gender non-conforming trans folks exist. And I shared this in another conversation, but like I looked at my like disability studies bookshelf and realized that predominantly the texts that I had were written either by white folks or white men. And so that need to like find the others that perhaps haven't been published, or the others who are publishing online, like that became not just a need to like do this for community, but especially for myself as a queer, you know, disabled person of color.
Yeah, and I think the first chapter is the origins of Sins Invalid. And I think, you know, for some folks like who are familiar with Sins Invalid, like they've been around for quite a few years and been foundational in terms of, you know, literally being at the epicenter of this disability justice framework. You know, these origin stories are important because, you know, nowadays, I don't know about what you think, but, you know, people say disability justice, but don't really understand it and have honestly appropriated it and have meant it to, you know, be disability rights, which is not correct. And this is why origin stories are so important, is to document the history, right, the work. So, you know, you dove into that immediately with the Sins Invalid origin story, but, you know, if people can read that, they should get your book, they should read that. But I want to know what your origin story is and how you came to find Crip Kinship and community, because those are kind of the stories that I still think that we need a lot of, just personal, individual kind of origin stories about how we came to be, because for so many of us, it's been a long evolution, a long process
Yes.
of learning, loving ourselves, all that stuff. That's still a work in progress. So, would you be open to sharing your origin story?
Yeah. And I think the important thing to mention is that it's not an origin story of one. It's informed by so many other people that I've had just like the amazing good fortune to meet. So I'm going to take us, we're going to time travel, and we're going to go back to my undergrad, and it is my junior year, and I'm taking my classes there because I just transferred from a community college. And I met a friend who would introduce himself by naming his disability. He would introduce his name, and then he would say, I have a disability. And that was the first time I ever heard somebody use that language, one. But two, there was a sense of pride around the word and the identity. That was brand new for me. That was brand new. And I think at like a certain point of like hearing it a few times, I asked, I don't know, or I said like, I don't know if you should tell people that. And then the conversation opened up to like, but why is it important? And why choose to be silent about an identity that's important to us when we can communicate it and politicize it? That was like a brain explosion moment, right? And so I, up to like at that moment, had to do a lot of self-inquiry, which I invite everybody to do. We live in an ableist, sanist society, an autist society. Like, we have to do this inquiry work often. And I had to unlearn a lot of those earlier messages. And I still have to step into that space sometimes. And and then we were like, okay, so I guess we need like a group about this on campus, because there wasn't one. And it was 2003. So we created one and then like kept it going for a few years. And when I was in graduate school, my mentor was like, hey, did you know there's this thing called disability studies? And that was another like, we can study and talk about and write about our disabilities. What? So, I feel like that's, if I had to point to an origin story, I'd say that moment. And then all the conversations, like after some of our events, we would all like gather, and go eat and talk. And that would have to be like the spark of everything.
Yeah, and I have to say that, especially in academia, so many disabled people still don't feel safe in identifying, and that the structures of academia, whether you're staff, faculty, or student, is violent and ableist and sadist. And there's still people who believe like you can't be bad, you can't be disabled, and somewhat, thrive as a scholar or teacher or student. And that is a lot of resistance and, frankly, emotional and intellectual labor on people like you who are still in these spaces doing the work. How important is it for you to be mindful of being visible and identify? Because, it's not like pride is not without risk, right? It's not.
Absolutely.
It's not rainbows and puppies. It's not about the confetti and just all the glitter, even though glitter is fantastic.
Yes, it is. I'm so glad. You said that.
Just all the glitter, right?
Mm-hmm.
But, it's still incredibly hostile and difficult, but yet so many of us continue to be open and telling our story for a lot of different reasons. Do you feel a particular responsibility or just pressure to represent, or just how do you reconcile with the struggle of being your full self, but also understanding that the profession that you're in actively excludes people like you?
Yeah.
Like us. Yeah.
I mean, I think I'm glad that you're naming the precarity of naming the self in academic spaces. And there have been so many amazing folks that have written about disclosure, non-visible disabilities. I'm thinking of like Helen Samuels, or Disclosure and Madness, the Margaret Price. There's so many amazing people that are writing about this slipperiness, this risk and precarity. And actually, I wasn't going to disclose. And I was, calls for articles come out, and I was in my, I think it was like 2009, I had started my PhD program, and an article came out in the Disability Studies Quarterly, which if you all have not read, it's definitely a wonderful, wonderful journal. And it was an article about, I think it was about madness, but I was writing about other people. And at some point, somewhere in there, I wrote the word we. And the editor wrote back and said, we won't accept it this way, but we think there's more. Maybe you have a story that you want to tell that maybe we'll consider. And I was like, oh shit, they see me. And that was the first time I was like, okay, let me rewrite this. And I wrote a piece, and it was about disclosure. And I feel like another big part of disclosure that's important to bring up is not everybody has the privilege to disclose. There's so many other elements that are woven into it. And so I have the privilege at this point to disclose, and I let my students know on the first day of class they're being taught by a disabled math person. And on certain days, I will have needs that I'll express to them. And other days, like, they might have needs that they'll express to me. And so, everything is negotiable. The pace of our class is negotiable. How many assignments we do once we check in halfway through the semester, like, all of that is negotiable.
Yeah, I feel like that is the power of representation. I think it's a starting point, right? It's not going to get us exactly all the way to liberation, but it's still incredibly powerful, especially in a world where we still don't see ourselves reflected and by any way close to parity, right? And I think, just if we look at popular culture and how sadists, in popular culture, just the misunderstandings of what it means to have a different kind of body mind. So for your students to see that, for you to be your authentic self, whether they're disabled or not, I think, has a lot of power and truth. But it's, again, so much of a part of a personal trust that people don't realize. They just take it for granted.
Yeah, and I think too, like, you reminded me of like academia and like ableism, Satanism. I'm also thinking too about, as somebody who teaches and learned how to write in academia, the I, like, first person writing was so villainized, like in an essay, like all my freshmen know, don't use I in an essay. And then, like, okay, but what does that mean and why? So I feel like, yeah.
It's also the we, because I use we quite a bit, and it's like, sometimes I think people might think, what is she referring to? Like, is she talking about everyone? I'm like, no, I'm really talking about disabled people, but, again, this royal we, try like, do what we say we, and I think that's, hopefully the reader picks up that the reason why I use we is, political, right? It's a political choice.
Yeah.
So talking about writing, because, this must have been such an interesting process for you. I love to, as a fellow writer, just learn a little bit more about what was your approach in writing this book, especially being in dialogue with Patty Bird, Berde, who is executive and artistic director of Sins Invalid, and just the other team members of Sins Invalid. How was your approach to make sure that, you write about them in a way that, is respectful, accurate, and collaborative?
Ooh, so many things are popping in my head. So I will say that the first version of this project, when I first spoke to Patty, and I think I emailed Patty, Leroy F. Moore Jr., Moore, and Seeley Quest, Seeley Quest. I emailed them in 2010. It's a long project. And when I emailed them, this was going to be my dissertation topic. I had learned about Sins Invalid. I was like, yes, I want to explore this. And I graduated in 2014 and didn't come back to the work until 2016. And when I came back, I realized that what I had originally done, which is what like the thesis governs, is I had taken these really powerful interviews and stories and led by theory and tried to fit them in. And so when I was reimagining the project, I went back to the interviews. Everybody at Sins Invalid was so gracious in gifting me, as many interviews as I needed. But this time I let the interviews guide what I was going to write. So what are the things that are coming up? What are the stories that everybody wants to tell? And then how do I center that? So it was a very intentional flip. And, again, it goes back to the I and the politicization of storytelling from a first person perspective. And out of respect, and just for the need of accuracy, I hadn't seen this before, but a lot of Sins Invalid's members either use she, her pronouns, or she, they pronouns, or he, they pronouns. And both hold, after conversations, it became super clear, both hold equal value. So in the book, depending on who I'm speaking to, if somebody is using both pronouns, I don't just state it once and leave it, but it'll be they throughout, or throughout. So that's the first thing that popped in my head as far as respect and the use of language and the centering of how people identify themselves and name themselves.
And I also think it must be interesting. I mean, were there ever issues in terms of, building trust? It's so important, the fact that they trusted you with their stories, but also you have your own, you're the author of this book, and, you clearly have an idea of the way you want to structure it. Were there ever kind of times where there were ever issues in terms of the way that you told their story or anything like that, because I think, there's a lot of things about ethics about writing, that we kind of don't think about in terms of, especially writing a story of multiply marginalized people who I think have had experiences just generalizing, been exploited, right? That just been, their stories been exploited in lots of different ways. And people have profited off of their stories or their wisdom or their knowledge. So what were some of the things that you did to hold yourself accountable and also just be as transparent with them?
This is a fabulous question. You are a phenomenal question writer. Nobody's asked this question yet.
This is what I do. This is what I do. Yeah.
So I was very honest. I think this is my like understanding, my read of it. I think it would have felt different if somebody from outside the community was coming to write stories that otherwise might be like taken or reframed or not told in the same way. And so because I did want to do this justice, and I've shared before, like, Alice, it felt very overwhelming at times because I wanted to get it right. And I had to just, like, in those moments, close my eyes and just remember, like, who was sitting behind me, like Patty, just like hanging out back there, having boba, which happened during one of our interviews. Like, everybody needs a boba break. But I had to, like, remember what the purpose of this was. And then I would also send, although I would just sometimes get like a thumbs up or not a lot of feedback, but like every time a chapter finished or edits finished, I sent it over. When the title finished, I sent it over, news about, like, okay, these are the publishers I'm thinking about, So it was, it felt like it was very much created in community, in kind of the sense that, like, how disability justice isn't just like a movement building framework. It has to be a practice. I wanted to make the writing of the book as much of a practice of disability justice as possible.
And that's what's so exciting, the fact that you had built the relationships, and you already had the kinship with the folks you're writing about. So it's not like you're writing from this distance. You are part of this ecosystem, this larger ecosystem, and I think it shows in your understanding and your placement of yourself within this, right? Like, this is, I think, framing is so important, right? Like the way we frame whatever we're writing, nonfiction, fiction, but framing ourselves in the larger story. Hopefully it gives the readers the context, right? I think that's what's so important, is that we can't separate ourselves as the writer if we're writing about something, right? It's not, even if it's not like autobiographical, it's, you're in it, and it's good to be explicit about that, right? Like, and I'm so glad that this book is for a general audience. This is not a disability studies book. It's really written in a way, I mean, clearly there are references, but it's really free of mostly free of academic jargon.
I
mean, there's always going to be a little bit, but I think that's another form of access, right? That's something that started with your dissertation, which clearly is probably for a much more specific audience. that really won't reach the masses. But you now are now over, of 11 years. This the germ of this story came about. You must feel so good, but also just, I hope you feel really proud of yourself. I feel proud of you, and I think these things take a lot of time, right? Like, good things can't be rushed. This is what I believe in general, but I think some stories, you have to take that time and care and process until something's ready. And it feels like this is really the culmination of a decade plus work.
Oh, that means so much. Like, I think I was holding my breath until I got affirmation from Patty and Leroy, and it means so. I can't express how much it means for it to be something that brings joy and just an honest reflection of what I experienced. Because I think the other thing about like framing ourselves in writing, especially if it's not autobiographical, but acknowledging that we, the writer, have impact and like thematic engagement with like what we're writing and researching. But I think the other like big thing about that, which is my hope for other folks that read this book, is for them to then ask, okay, so if I was clear about my relationship to Sins Invalid and the work, as reader, what is your like impact, connection? What will you take and implement in your daily lives, whether you're disabled or not? Like, what is this magical disabled wisdom that you want to incorporate for your and your community's liberation?
So I know that we're going to have a Q&A soon, but I want to ask one question finally, because I want to make sure that I get this final question in, because we're looking toward the future. Disability culture has grown, as has the disability justice movement. What gives you hope personally right now? And, what do you think is the future of the disability culture and disability justice based on everything that you've learned about Sins Invalid, but also just your own experiences as a disabled person? Like, what do you want to see in the future? Because I'm incredibly excited that this book is out in the world so that I could just refer it and just recommend it and just say, read this book, we need this book. But it's just the tipping point, it's just the tip of the iceberg. We need lots more, but I think it's such a wonderful, hopefully, beginning of many more things. But what do you want to see in the future?
That's such a delicious question. The book ends, this is a paraphrase, it ends with something like, inviting the reader to write the next book and the next and the next in this disability justice telling. What do I want to see in the future? One of the biggest gifts that I don't think a lot of folks know about is the ways in which, like, woven into the principles of disability justice is cross solidarity work, like cross movement building work. And this kind of synced up really lovely in a lovely way for me. During the beginning of the pandemic, somebody had posted had reshared a picture with text from NAP Ministry. And NAP Ministry is created by Tricia Hersey, TRICIA, and Hersey, HERSEY. And it was a bringing together of anti-capitalist politics, which is so important for disability justice, anti-racist organizing, which is important to disability justice, And this push for us to really consider, or perhaps like reconsider, how we engage with rest. And Percy's argument was like, rest is anti-racist, anti-capitalist, organizing and activism. And
Trisha has a 2-book deal. There's
seriously?
Yes.
Oh
So
my
Trisha, I follow the Dapper Ministry on Twitter, and this past year, I saw an announcement that she made a 2-book deal.
Nice.
So, I think in the next few years, we're going to get even more what we need for the culture, right?
Oh my God, that's phenomenal. I can't wait to read them.
Me too.
Because it's this really beautiful like connection and conversation with crip time, mad time. So I see this just really lovely synergy work that I imagine and I know is going to continue into the future. And another kind of future idea, that I thought about and wrote about in this last chapter is about crip doulas. And this is coming from, the wisdom and magic of our ancestor, Stacy Milburn. And I can read a brief definition from this chapter, if that's okay.
Of course. I think the audience would love it.
Yeah, I want to bring Stacy into the room. So this is the final chapter, Manifesting Our Collective Futures. And this is 2 small baby paragraphs. Although the reminder and refrain that we are creators of our own futures energizes and invigorates me, it also leaves me with questions. How do we begin to do this work? Even after all the internal adjustments and empowered transformations take place, how do we begin manifesting a future for all our body minds? The first answer to this question comes from Crip ancestor Stacy Milburn. During episode 6 of the Disability Visibility podcast, Alice Wong interviewed Stacy and Leah Lakshmi Piepsna Samarasinha about the labor and work of disabled queer femmes of color. In particular, Stacy spoke about crip doulas. Quote, the work of supporting people rebirthing themselves as disabled or more disabled has a name. We are doulas. Crip mentorship /coaching /modeling at its best is disability doulaship. The fact that society doesn't even have language to describe this transition speaks to how ableism and isolation people with disabilities face in figuring out how to be in their body minds in this ableist world, end quote. Amid non-disabled supremacy, its messages, its restrictions, a crip doula is a supportive guide. Crip doulas stress that we do not grow into our present or future selves on our own. We move into these places with love and mentorship of community. Together, we rebirth ourselves into our disabilities or into our shifting disabled body minds. We do this work in celebration with struggle, but we never journey alone. Crip doulaship is communal appreciation and acknowledgement. It is, as Stacy argues, necessary for our survival and our resilience.
What a beautiful way to end our conversation, and thank you for this reading, and thank you for referencing my podcast, which, that episode was part of the very early beginnings of my podcast, which started in 2017.
Yeah, this was episode 9.
Unbelievable. And it just brings me back to that moment and how grateful I am to have a body of 100 episodes. Just to let the audience know, my podcast ended April of this year, and I thought 100 would be just a lovely way to end things, but there's this archive of crip culture, crip kinship that's out there. And, I think we're all doing what we can in our own ways to document our lives and our stories and our wisdom. And for me, so much of the magic is the interactions, right? The conversations. Because I think stories as individuals, they are also important, but also I think there's that ephemeral quality when it's in connection, in conversation with, one-on-one. And it's really beautiful. I don't know if Sam wants to join out, but I want to make sure there's time for Q&A from the audience, for you. So take it away, Sam.
Hello. Thank you both for such a beautiful conversation. That was really, really wonderful. And I just can feel so much warmth and heart and joy in the virtual room. So thank you both. It's really lovely. So we do have 2 questions, and I'll just start with this question from Austin. And it says, with regards to the importance of education and the goals of DVP, how do you think can California Department of Rehabilitation and the WIOA assist or expand disability justice?
Well, I think bureaucracies or just agencies, that's really, these are systems that need to be dismantled. They're completely reshaped. They're reimagined, but that's, I don't know. I think that's a really tough question, because the systems that currently exist were never built for us in mind. And the one way to approach it would be, let's get more disabled folks into every aspect of society. So maybe more disabled people in decision-making positions of power. I'm a big fan of political participation. Disabled people can vote and get involved in their communities. I think that's one way to kind of help make a difference in the way these agencies and departments think about things. But, so much of that, the way things are structured now, it's very entrenched. And people don't want to change. And I say people, I mean institutions, the states. So, I don't know about, in terms of disability justice, I think so much of it is about resisting these kinds of structures, or at least, creating kind of complementary alternative pathways, right, for people to find support. I think we see through this pandemic, collective care and mutual aid has been a real thing. And I think people do this already informally when they don't have access to benefits, when they don't have access to services. People still end up finding a way. So that's always going to be there. But for actual change in those departments, I wish I had an answer. Shayda, do you have any thoughts on this? Because I'm not even sure if I, address this properly. So if you have any ideas.
Yeah. So I am thinking about, and I hope this gets to addresses another part of the question, but I'm thinking about how a lot of resources, disability resources that I've engaged with or that I've had me over to do a workshop, just in the language. And I think, Alice, this goes back to your point about just like systemic things that have to be resolved and challenged, which is what disability justice does. But disability is still seen as a quote unquote bad word. I've seen the word ability used to substitute for disability. And so I think even in just the language, the types of language that's being used to describe disability in itself is important to look at. And then also acknowledge the lineage. Like, I had no idea that there were disabled Black folks that were involved with the heart of disability organizing until I read Valissa Thompson's blog, right? And that was the first time I learned about Bradley Lomax and Johnny Lacey. So like acknowledging the history of your institution also, I think is an important thing to do.
Thank you. And we have another question. This one's from Jeanette. You talk about crip sex in your book. Can you tell us a little about the importance of crip sex and its relation to Sin Invalid and disability justice?
Oh, that's lovely. Hi, Jeanette. So I think one of the biggest openings and spaces of possibility that disability justice opened for me was the realization that there is an inherent political right to pleasure that disabled folks have, which hasn't often been addressed. And this idea of crip sex really asks us to challenge normative constructions of sex and view how it's been ableist, or how it's been fill in other forms of oppression after that. And if we're going to be politicizing our body minds, then pleasure, and I don't just mean like sexual pleasure, right? Because it's making space for asexual folks as well, or ace folks as well. But it's opening space for us to think about the politicization of pleasure. What could that mean for a person? What does that mean for a person? And if it's something that you are interested in, it's your political right to access.
If I could just jump in, I think a wonderful book for people to learn more about this is Pleasure Activism by Adrienne Marie Brown, who is also a disabled queer person of color. And pleasure activism, I think, really changed the way I thought about pleasure, and I think it's a wonderful complementary book to Crip Kinship. I definitely recommend people to think about how pleasure is just like napping, a form of resistance. It is inherently political. We say we need to create spaces that give us joy, that activism shouldn't be this hustle culture or grind culture.
Yeah, and if I can, because I talked about pleasure activism in the book, and there was this wonderful quote where Adrienne says, we need to align our pleasures with our values. And I think that understanding that aspect too is a really, really lovely way to think about what crip sex invites us to consider.
And I think there's so many parallels with queer culture in the sense that we're expanding what it means to be intimate, what it means to be connected, what families mean, right? I think there's so many parallels and very clear connections as well. So I think, all of this, we do kind of blow up all the binaries, but also just, make everything fluid, but really just unravel our understandings of what pleasure and intimacy can be. Because there's so much goes beyond just sex, physical sex.
Yes.
That's great. We have one more question, and this is from Ava. Ava says, I am newly chronically ill and disabled and am struggling to find a Crip community, especially being in my 20s and a queer woman. Where can I start?
Shayda, I think you'd be the first person to answer this.
I mean, I'm thinking too about cripping and queering your Instagram and your Twitter if you haven't already. And, you know, following disability visibility. You know, I'm also, I don't know if I can just put my email in the chat.
It's up to you. I mean,
why not? I can share my favorite like reading list of queer disabled texts. I can spell my Gmail.
I'm also going to put the link up. There's a really cool website called No It Insights. It is by chronically ill activists. And she came up with this hashtag called NEISVOID. It is just to like identify the lived experience of chronic illness. That for many people, it is this, future that's uncertain, that ebbs and flows, and that there's no endpoint the way we think about illness or disease. And I think this person has been one of the many people, especially in online communities, that really create a space for chronically ill people, because there's still a lot of chronically ill people that don't identify as disabled just yet, or maybe not recognize that. Do I count? I'm like, I think you count, but
yes.
But a lot of people just, it takes time for people to kind of feel themselves and just find others, and then just feel more comfortable. But I think at this online hashtag as a place where you can find community if you are online. Not to say you have to be online.
Yeah, and if you are online, Ava, Julia just shared that I have a list of beautiful queer Crip social media accounts that I can share. Yeah, because I think, I so feel what you wrote, Ava. I remember feeling like I didn't count for a long time.
Yeah, if I could just put one last thing up. In my anthology, there's a wonderful piece by Scott Tribaki, who writes a manifesto, a queer Crip manifesto regarding fashion. And Rebirth Garments is their company, but it's really also a community as well. But this is very explicitly queer Crip, and it's absolutely lovely.
And I'm pretty sure they have a website, but I first came across
Yes.
Rebirth Garments on Etsy. Yeah.
Oh, there's a love birch. You should have some birch too.
we are out of questions, but if you have anything else to share, definitely want to offer the space. But it has been an hour. Don't want to take up everybody's time. So it's up to you, Shayda, if you have anything else to say, or Alice. And before you do, just want to say thank you again so much to everyone at home for joining us here. And thank you to Kyla and Ray and Nicholas for offering our accessibility options. And it's been a really wonderful conversation. So I'm glad we were able to have this at Book Soup.
Me too. And I'm really grateful to be here in this space with you all. Thank you, Shayda. Thank you, Sam.
Yeah,
thank you to everyone who's here.
Yeah, and everybody in the chat. I mean, you've all been giving so much love that we've created our own space of Crip Kinship and love, which I'm so grateful for. And just really, really grateful for all the conversation in the chat. And Alice, this was like such a joy. I'm wondering if we could take a selfie before we end.
Let's do it.
Okay,
Here,
good.
I'll do it. Here.
Okay.
One.
Do you want it just the two of you?
Oh, then we'll do the four of us. Why not?
Uh,
This one was big. So 1, 2, 3. Okay, I'm gonna email it to y'all.
Thank you.
Thank you for putting up with us.
Beautiful.
Thank you. All
Good
right.
night.
Good night, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Good night. Have a wonderful rest of your evening.
Thank you.